I am Sneha Kathy Sebastian, the research editor at the forum. In this session, we will decode the terrorist threats in the West. The session chair is Dr. John M. Nomikos. Sir is the director at the Research Institute for European and American Studies in Athens, Greece. He is also the chairman of the European Intelligence Academy, founding editor at the Journal of European and American Intelligence Studies, and head of the History, Politics, and International Relations Department at the Athens campus of Webster University, and also an assistant professor. He is a master certified anti-terrorism specialist. Sir was awarded the 2019 Life Achievement Award for the development of intelligence studies in Europe by the International Association for Intelligence Education, European chapter. Additionally, John Sir is also the advisory board member of the Indic Researchers Forum. Welcome to the conference, sir. The speakers for the session are Dr. Hans Jacob Schindler, Senior Director at the Counter-Extremism Project in New York and Berlin, co-chair of the advisory board of the Global Diplomatic Forum in London, a member of the advisory board for Justice for Kurds, and a member of the board of directors of Compliance and Capacity Skills International in New York, as well as a teaching fellow at the Academy for Security in the Economy in Essen. In 2013, he joined the Isil, Al-Qaeda, and Taliban sanctions monitoring team of the United Nations Security Council, and also served as the team's coordinator from 2015 to 2018. Welcome to the conference, sir. The second speaker is Professor Dr. Christian Conard. He is a professor of international security at Dublin City University in Ireland. He is also a professor of policing and security, as well as the director of the International Centre for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales. In addition, he is the director of the Jean Monnet Centre for Excellence and director of the Jean Monnet Network on EU Counter-Terrorism. Previously, he served as the academic director and professor at the Institute for European Studies, a professor of international politics, head of discipline in politics, and the director of the European Institute for Security and Justice at the University of Dundee. I extend a very warm welcome to all the speakers. Now, I hand it over to John Nomikos, sir. Over to you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mrs. Neha, for the introduction of the CVs of the distinguished scholars of the third session. I will pass the floor to Dr. Hans Jacob Schindler, who is going to focus on decoding the threat of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the West. Dr. Hans Jacob Schindler, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much.
And I'm sorry, you can spend 30 minutes, sir. 25 to 30 minutes.
I will do my very best. So 1 second, I just need to make sure that I can actually share my presentation. Could be going wrong, I hope. So can you see my slides?
Yes, sir.
Perfect, fantastic. So thank you so much. Really is a pleasure and an honor to be able to be taking part in today's conference, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. I've been asked to look at the Al-Qaeda and Islamic State in the West, which, as you will see from my presentation, will also focus to a certain extent on external threats, because the structures of ISIL and Al-Qaeda inside Europe are not quite as organized as they are in conflict regions. That's why I'm first look at the overall threat assessment of what we have and can expect in Europe on this issue. Then I will look a little bit on the online environment, because there have been quite remarkable progress on the regulation of online platforms in Europe, and I just wanted to highlight what was happening. Then, of course, I will go through the external risks, but I will only go through the regions that are mostly relevant for Europe. Obviously, every conflict region in which ISIL and Al-Qaeda operates and has some capabilities indirectly in medium to long run can be problematic for Europe, but I'll look at the most pertinent one, the Middle East and Gulf, of course, due to geographic proximity and the history. Then I look at Africa, which is a growing area of concern. And then, of course, given that we just passed the 1-year anniversary of the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the killing of Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda, in Kabul, I'll have a little bit of a longer look on Afghanistan and what it may mean in the long run. So let me start with the overall threat assessment. We are very clearly still in a fairly complex internal threat situation. We have, of course, a continuing threat of inspired attacks. These are attackers that are somewhat linked to ISIL, but not part of the hierarchy, and feel inspired by ISIL or Al-Qaeda propaganda. Very famously in Vienna, a individual that was prevented from traveling to Syria and then released from prison conducted a quite massive terror attack with a long gun in November 2020. But we also have directed attacks. Directed attacks are a little bit more severe than inspired attacks, because what happens is that the cell or the individual perpetrator is already on the ground in Germany, in this case, or in Europe, but gets directions, finances to a certain extent from the either ISIL or Al-Qaeda network abroad. One particular famous example is a cell of Tajik perpetrators that was arrested in April 2020. They were trying to perpetrate attacks against US military installations in Germany and were instructed both by ISIL or ISIS leaders in Syria, but also very significantly already at that time in Afghanistan. And then we have what I call self-motivated attacks. These are attacks where the individual is neither adhering necessarily to the ISIL or Al-Qaeda ideology as a organizational framework, but is radicalizing and i.e. getting more violent through online radicalization that takes a broad version of sources. And the murder of the French teacher Paty in October 2020 is, of course, one of the examples that you have to mention here. That means we still have an active sympathizer scene in Europe that both ISIL and Al-Qaeda can tap into. However, since they are much less organized than in the last 2 decades, it's really hard to ascertain who is belonging to this active sympathizer scene and who's not. Germany, for example, assumes that there are several 10,000 of these individuals in Germany alone that are at any point willing to use violence, that are somehow sympathetic to the ideological ideas of ISIL, Al-Qaeda, or are self-motivated, radicalized. For example, we still see financial transactions to the families and individuals that used to be foreign terrorist fighters and are at the moment in Al-Hol camp in Syria, a place that I'm going to mention a little bit later again. That means we have a large part of individuals that are potentially problematic to conduct inspired, directed, or self-motivated attacks. And it's quite important to keep monitoring those. And we do assess, at least we at CEP, but also the governments that we work with, that we assess that despite the COVID-19 slowdown, obviously physical restrictions, travel restrictions, had prevented large-scale events. This is now slowly coming to an end. We had active threat levels remaining in Europe, and we may now see a slowly but surely an uptick in attacks, at least on the inspired, directed, and self-motivated kind in Europe. What we do not see as a major problem right now, however, down the line, definitely looking at the various conflict zones, is a attack in the classical sense as Paris 2015 was, or Al-Qaeda attacks in the past were. And I'll get to reasons why this is a growing threat, which means there is, at the moment at least, neither in Syria, nor in Africa, nor in Afghanistan, an external attack capability in the way that you would organize a multi-participant complex attacks of the variant that we've seen in Paris 2015. Simply the training infrastructure, the traveling is too hard, and these groups are still reconstituting themselves in the conflict zones with one notable exception. Now, let me come to the online environment. We have seen in the last 2 years, in particular, significant progress on the regulatory front. The first was the 2021 terrorist content online regulation. Now, it's quite significant, if not really harsh, a piece of regulation, in that it now demands from platform to remove terrorist content that it got notified, or the platform got notified with, within 1 hour. This was definitely a great success to make sure that platforms who have the capability, who have the assets, who have the ability to remove terrorist content actually do so. But unfortunately, we are still in Europe, by and large, subscribing to the idea that platforms should not proactively look for terrorist content, and therefore in the regulation it says a platform is allowed to do prior proactive measures, i.e. actively searching for terrorist content on their platform, but there is no obligation, which in the end means that platforms do not actively look for measures. Now there is a, as I have pointed out, I think in many presentations, including here at the Indic Research Forum, there is a logical problem with this kind of approach. Obviously, it is ensuring that platforms are not removing too much material, but looking at global platforms and their size, like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram, and the amount of data that gets uploaded every year, or every day, every second, having an approach that requires someone to notify the terrorist content, while only having about 400 police officers in the entire European Union, and that's not even a connected network of police officers. There's just all the police officers in all the member states looking at online crime, not terrorism, online crime as such, is somewhat assuming that 400 people could go through millions of uploads every day to find illegal or terrorist-related content. So we still, from the Counter-Extremism Project, see this very critically, but at least it was a first step. More significantly, and I think more longer lasting in its effect, is the Digital Services Act that is now in the last stages of actually becoming law in the European Union. Here, the really important point is that there are, for the first time ever, risk assessments for platforms inside the European Union that are necessary. It divides the companies in the European Union between platforms and specifically large platforms, defined as 20 million users per month inside the territory of the European Union. It resolves, to a certain extent, jurisdictional questions, because it does require that each platform has a European Union representative in one of the European Union countries, which then hopefully will also facilitate information exchange and data exchange between law enforcement and the platforms. And for extra large platforms, not only are there risk assessments necessary, there are also regular and potentially specific audits. However, the DSA still refers only to notified content. So the weakness of the TCO is transported into the DSA. Nevertheless, it's a very, very good start, because now we do have a regulatory framework as such, and in combination with the Digital Markets Act, which regulates financial issues and commercial issues on the internet, we have a good set of regulations now that we can then, along the line, work to improve. For example, the audit structure in the DSA is still very much fashioned on audit structures that we've seen in the 1980s in the financial industry, and does not take account of large-scale audit failures that happened in the financial industry since. For example, there is no need for an audit company to switch mandates, which means audit companies could get, again, as it was with Enron, become too close to the individual platforms, and a range of other issues that needs improvement, but at least it is a good start. What is still a bit of a gap but developing is the issue of regulation of cryptocurrencies. Here, the European Union has passed a package, or suggested a package of measures in June last year that included full transparency on all cryptocurrency transactions, which in our view at CEP is a significant step, because it demands now that technical issues such as tumblers and mixers, who are used exclusively to obfuscate transaction path, if this is passed in this way, would be effectively illegal inside the European Union, which then very nicely divides cryptocurrency transactions from legal and being illegal. Now, let me look at the external threat, because I have said the threat environment is complex, but it's also inside the European Union, but it's also fed by external conflict zones. And then, of course, here still and continuing, Syria and Iraq are really a major concern for the European Union. We've seen ICC cells both in Syria and Iraq to slowly but surely constitute attack structures. Yes, there were significant successes by taking out ISIS leaders repeatedly in Syria. Incidentally, in the area of operations and control of Al-Qaeda affiliate HTS, which really kind of puts to bed this discussion whether there was a rivalry or this is a rivalry between Al-Qaeda and Isil. Syria still operates as the central ISIS propaganda hub. See, for example, the death of Maher al-Agal, who was killed a couple of weeks ago in Syria and was one of the chiefs of this propaganda apparatus, which then, of course, is the basis on which inspired or even directed attacks are conducted. They work to inspire and direct attacks, and we have great concerns. I think everyone in the European Union has about the state of some of the larger FTF camps in the Kurdish-controlled areas, in particular Al-Hol, which, according to the UN, has now become somewhat of an administrative center for ISIS. I've mentioned that there are financial transactions to FTF family members into this camp, and the camp seems to be distributing funds outwards to particular ISIL cells within Syria, which is, of course, a great concern because a holding place that has been set up to make sure that these foreign-terrorist fighters and ISIL sympathizers in Syria are no longer able to conduct violence is now becoming an administrative center for the network, at least in Syria as such. Therefore, the absolute priority of the German government is still to get at least all women and children of German nationality and with links to Germany out of these camps in order to reduce the population in these camps that the Syrian Kurds will have to take care of. Of course, there is massive concern what will happen if the Turkish government would decide to have a large-scale military operation on and against the Kurdish the Kurds in Syria. Luckily, so far that hasn't happened. But as the prison break a couple of months ago in Kurdish-controlled areas of Syria has demonstrated, any kind of breakdown of the security structure that exists within the Kurdish area can lead to very quickly to large-scale fallouts that will then, in the medium term, also, of course, affect Europe as well. There are a couple more points to HTS and HUD. HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HUD, Quras al-Din. We assess them to continue being linked to Al-Qaeda, whatever Mr. Julani says, and there is now even hate propaganda from ISIS-K in Khorasan that mentions that Mr. Julani does still belong to Al-Qaeda, and we have not seen a full ideological separation from Al-Qaeda, only a verbal one, after having checked with the Al-Qaeda leadership whether this would be okay, but no ideological turnaround and real distancing from the ability or the will to conduct external attacks. And both HTS as well as HUD continue to include foreigners, in particular a couple of dozen foreign nationals that operate within Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which of course begs the question, if this is just a Syrian internal opposition group, why on earth would you need foreigners to continue to serve within your fighting ranks? The other aspect is the Gulf, and here in particular, of course, AQAP, which still is the most innovative Al-Qaeda affiliate. It still runs the Inspire online magazine, the very first online magazine. AQAP in the mid-2000s was previewing anything that ISIL did then later in Iraq and Syria. It had an online presence, it controlled territory and as well as cities, it levied taxes, and it had and continues to have a very developed external strike capability with a long arm and a long view. For example, if you look at the fact that a couple of years ago we all had to put our laptops into the garbage, into the luggage hold of airplanes, because AQAP had managed to construct laptops in which half the battery was was explosive material, which means the laptop would work at security checks, but would still, if strategically placed at the outside, at the seat and the window of the airplane, would be able to bring an airplane down. Or the Pensacola attacks, which was fairly simple. The guy simply shot his classmates, but what was significant here is that he had been an AQAP member from the moment he joined the Saudi military, more than a decade before the attack ago, and waited for a decade for the conditions to be right to conduct these attacks. So despite the fact that AQAP has a diminishing leadership cadre in Yemen, it still remains very much entrenched in the civil war in Yemen. And without the civil war ending, any hope of getting a grip on AQAP, apart from simply doing over-the-horizon drone strikes, will remain elusive. And AQAP retains the ability and the will to conduct overseas attacks. This was already quite a serious situation, but currently, if you look at the current jihadist threat that could affect very quickly Europe, Central African, and especially the northern half of the entire continent, is of major concern. You have several large ISIS affiliates. You have ISIS in the Greater Sahara, you have ISIS in West Africa, you have ISIS in Central Africa, which has two different variations of it, and you have ISIS in Somalia. These are luckily not yet cooperating with each other or regionally sharing resources, very different to what happens in West Africa when we talk about JNIM. This is an ISIL coalition that does share resources and training with its fighters, operates in the same, practically in the same geographical area than ISIS in Greater Sahara does. It does not fight ISIS in the Greater Sahara, but they operate separately from each other. It's a coalition that Al-Qaeda had set up, led at the moment by Iyad al-Ghali, set up in 2017 to recombine splinter groups from the big flagship Al-Qaeda affiliate in the Northern African region, AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and it's now operating across borders, and both JNIM as well as Islamic State in the Greater Sahara are trying to make a push towards the coastal areas of Western Africa, which would then give them not only access to potentially ports, but also greater access to the drugs flows that come from South America into the western parts of Africa and then travel through Western Africa and North Africa into Europe, which would mean a much larger scale financing ability than these groups have at this point. And then, of course, you have the largest Al-Qaeda affiliate, not only on the continent, but depending on how you define Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the largest, if not one of the largest Al-Qaeda affiliates worldwide. It's now controlling about 30% of the country of Somalia. And we have a transition from Amazon, the African troops that were there to keep Al-Shabaab in check, into the African Union transition mission in Somalia. And the word transition means it's a very temporary mission. And there is a not insignificant risk that we will see something like an Afghanistan scenario in Somalia once ATMIS is also ending in a couple of years. Negative trends here are we have an increasing crime convergence, not only as it was traditionally, the involvement of Hezbollah in the drug trafficking through West Africa, but also increasingly transport services and security services provided by Islamist terror groups of the Al-Qaeda and ISIS variant along the transport routes. We have an absolute risk of destabilization. You have heard the amount of coups that have been happening, especially in the West Africa region the last couple of months. You have seen how MINUSMA now is more or less paralyzed. MINUSMA is the UN mission in Mali. Not only a couple of weeks ago did Egypt suspend its participation in Mali, in MINUSMA, but which was the biggest troop contributor. Now Germany, a couple of days ago, decided as well to pause its involvement in MINUSMA, simply because the coup government in Mali is not allowing overflight rights, which means the change of troops or the resupply of troops that work with MINUSMA in the north of the country, which is, of course, a massive risk. The G5 Sahel, which was set up in order to stem terrorist activity in the region, is at the moment paralyzed because several of the governments that make up the G5 Sahel are now have changed through military coups, and the regional structure still needs to find a way to work with these new governments. And of course, since these are very active and at the moment the most successful jihadist activities or Islamist terrorist activities, both for ISIL as well as Al-Qaeda, there is a concern that we will see, not to the same extent as to Syria, but more regionally based foreign terrorist fighter flows into the region, and if the region totally destabilizes, which is not without a possibility at this particular point, then we will definitely see migration flows from the region towards Europe, which always, as we have seen in the past from Syria and Afghanistan, include also the risk to have foreign test fighters or attackers sneaking into Europe via these migration flows. That's why my organization is starting in a couple of weeks a one-year project with a German organization that is close to the government on highlighting the security risks that are established in this region and what it means for Berlin and Europe as security in the medium to long run. Now, final point, because I'm slowly getting towards the end of my time, the external attack risks from Afghanistan. You've all heard the documentaries and saw the news in the last couple of days what's happening in Afghanistan. Just as a reminder, when we're talking about Afghanistan, we're talking about multiple affiliates operating in the country. Here are the main operational areas of these. So not only Al-Qaeda around Zawahiri, but also AQIS, the affiliate that Al-Qaeda had set up in order to counter the rise of Isil in 2014 and 15. We still have legacy groups like the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, IMU, and the Islamic Jihad Group, an offshoot of the IMU, which really look towards Central Africa. We have Khatiba Imam Bukhari, same thing, Central Africans trying to get back into Central Asia. We have the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, or the East Turkestan Islamic Party, ETIM, that are the Uyghurs, a couple of hundred at this point in Afghanistan. I just want to point out, in Syria at the moment, actively with HTS and HUD, a couple of thousand Uyghurs. So the real Uyghur operation area, it remains in Syria, not necessarily in Afghanistan. And then we have a small list of quite dangerous Pakistani groups that are linked to Al-Qaeda, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Taiba, in the Taliban, Pakistan, TTP, that are all now organized, and all of this laundry list is organized into the Taliban military and security structure by this one, the Haqqani network. You've heard a lot about this, the Haqqani network, and I've spoken about this. The Haqqani network is one of the significant and at the moment the most powerful individual structure within the Taliban regime in Kabul. It is traditionally been the link between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, which also it didn't start in 2001 it started in 2021. It started under the father of the current acting interior minister of Afghanistan, Zero Haqqani. His father, Jalaluddin Haqqani, was good friends with Osama bin Laden in the east of Afghanistan during the Soviet occupation and the war against the Soviet occupation, was responsible, Haqqani was, for the organizing of the Arab volunteers, out of which then subsequently Al-Qaeda grew. So it's now a two-generation relationship between the Haqqani network and Al-Qaeda. And what the Haqqani network does is to reorganize the foreign terrorist fighters, so Pakistanis and others who are fighting with these groups that I outlined in Afghanistan, into the Taliban security structure as special forces and as shock troops, thereby repeating some of the structures that and the relationship that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban had prior to 2001 in Afghanistan. And then finally, and most significantly, this is the core operational area of the Islamic State in Iraq, in the Levant and Khorasan, ISIL-K, the affiliate of ISIL in Afghanistan, specifically and purposefully set up by ISIL core in 2015. So very different to all of the other affiliates of ISIL around the globe, where the group simply accepted the loyalty pledges. In this one, here in Afghanistan, the group was actually sending, as it did at the same time to Libya, envoys from Syria and Iraq to build up this network structure in Afghanistan. It is still operating quite actively. Yes, it doesn't control a lot of territory, but it does, and we at the Counter-Extremism Project monitor their propaganda output from ISIL Khorasan on a daily basis. They are conducting large numbers of attacks against civilian targets and against the Taliban, against religious and ethnic minorities in the country on a recurring basis. And the Taliban do have a massive problem in dealing with this, because this affiliate is even more hardline in its ideology than the Taliban regime is. So any question about human rights or women's education if the Taliban would go too moderate or go too hard in their defense against ISIL-K, this group has the actual risk that it would then serve as a receptor for disgruntled Taliban, i.e. the Taliban always have to walk a very tight rope between the fight against ISIL-K and the cohesiveness of their own forces and the regime in the country. Now, what can we expect? Less likely is the emergence of the classical terror camp infrastructure that we saw prior to 2001, the easy to destroy infrastructure. So this is Tarunta camp before and after the US military took care of it with a couple of airstrikes, and about 30 minutes transformed the camps from this to this state. So I don't think specifically built camps is the way to go, in particular since the Taliban are already training the foreign terrorist fighters and Al-Qaeda affiliates as part of their military structure. However, there is also no necessity for Al-Qaeda to re-establish this kind of camp infrastructure, which prior to 2001, more or less 90% of which was used not to train Al-Qaeda operatives for attacks abroad, but massive amounts of foreign volunteers for the fight of the Taliban against the Northern Alliance, which at that point held about 20 to 25% of Afghan territories in the north of the country, which means there was a very active, ongoing civil war with a massive opponent in the north, at that point being resupplied by Iran, by Russia, by France, by Germany and the US and others, until 2001. And the deal with Al-Qaeda was that they would train those foreign volunteers, transfer them to Taliban command and control, and then because of this were allowed to train a small but significant number of terrorist operatives, because Al-Qaeda wants to establish and continue to establish a terrorist elite, i.e. large-scale, interesting, complex, impressive attacks is what Al-Qaeda wants. It is very different from ISIL, which is happy for inspired and directed attacks. Al-Qaeda's aim remains complex attacks, and for this you need highly trained operatives. Now, unfortunately, this also means these highly trained operatives don't require this massive camp infrastructure in Afghanistan. Since 2001, of course, we've been seeing mobile training camps doing exactly that. And we have the problem that now, in difference to what it was prior to 2001, we do have a problem that Afghanistan is able to and capable of printing new identity papers for these foreign terrorist fighters. And we've seen already a couple of nationalizations of foreign terrorist fighters, i.e. they've become now national citizens of Afghanistan. In the Haqqani network, the link between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban is in control not only of the Interior Ministry, but also in control of the Ministry of the National Passport Office within the Interior Ministry, as well as the Ministry for Refugees, which is the perfect setup to send foreign terrorist fighters back to Europe, hence the medium to long-term threat here. And as I said already at the beginning of my presentations, we had already attempts to direct attacks from within ISIL in Afghanistan. In Europe, the Tajik cell that was arrested in April 2020 and was just this year, a couple of weeks ago, being put into prison for many, many years. This concludes my short presentation for today on the ISIL Al-Qaeda threat to Europe, including its external threats. And I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hans-Jakob Schindler, for the thorough analysis of analyzing what's going on the terrorist network geographically, starting from Europe, then moving to, Gulf State, Middle East, of course, Africa, and definitely, Afghanistan as well in the Caucasus area. And of course, I would just reserve the time to summarize all the comments, at the end of the second speaker, who is Dr. Christian Kaunert, who is going to talk about counter-terrorism cooperation between the European Union and NATO. Without taking it more time, I would like, Professor Christian Kaunert to take the floor. Hello, Christian.
John, thank you for the very kind introduction. Thank you, Hans Jakob, for the previous presentation. And of course, thank you to the organizers, the Indic Forum, for having me with you. It's a great pleasure to be there with you again to talk on such an important topic. So thank you so much for having me. The topic that I want to discuss is on EU-NATO Counter-Terrorism Cooperation. I term this challenges and opportunities because I think this is a very important topic. Now, why is this topic interesting? Let me go back to the 8th of July 2016, when the President of the European Council and the President of the European Commission met with the Secretary General of NATO and signed a joint declaration in Warsaw. In that declaration, they suggested that they have 7 different aspects to working much more closely together, amongst which there was countering of hybrid threats, there was operational cooperation, including at sea and on migration, cybersecurity and defense industry and research, exercises, and supporting Eastern and Southern partners in their capacity building efforts. This is part of a broader trend, a broadening of the security agenda more generally, increasingly that involves crime, drug trafficking, and of course terrorism that is at the heart of this. Also the blurring of internal and external security as we've seen, and of course terrorism increasingly as one of the biggest security threats of our time. Now let me put this cooperation between the EU and NATO in context, because of course in order to understand EU-NATO cooperation on counterterrorism, you have to understand EU and European and US cooperation. Here, a lot of that cooperation initially grew out of bilateral linkages, primarily between police, internal security services. No European country, you may say, has a really special relationship in counterterrorism, even though there's quite a few that have really excellent relations with the United States and very close link. The United Kingdom, of course, has very close relations between the Department of Homeland Security in the US and the Home Office, a relationship that really seriously increased after 9/11 in terms of counterterrorism. It grew out of the 1979 Police Working Group on Terrorism, where operational knowledge was shared, a cooperation that was derived from fighting drug fighters, US that started obviously at the time to fight drug traffickers abroad, with an increasing internationalization of US policing services, and of course transatlantic counterterrorism really built onto that model of countering drug trafficking. A number of US agencies like the FBI, the DAA, the drug enforcement agencies have agents in Europe without operational power, and of course we also have secondment of Department of Justice personnel. Equally, Italy has very close relationships with the United States on organized crime, a working group on organized crime and anti-mafia cooperation. Germany has very close links here also with US police. Bundeskriminalamt has had direct access to US National Criminal Information Center. Since 2011, it has really significantly strengthened in relation to the Bundeskriminalamt and also the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution and also the BND, the Foreign Intelligence Agency. Also, perhaps less well known, but very strong internal security relations that the US has also with France and the Netherlands. And France, of course, with a certain experience of fighting terrorism due to the historical links with Algeria, 1986, very tough anti-terrorism legislation, and the agencies under the command of France, the Direction de la Surveillance du Territoire and the Direction Générale de la Sécurité Extérieure, both of them with very close links with their US counterparts. Similarly, in the Netherlands, we have the Dutch Civilian Intelligence Agency that also has very close links with the FBI. So overall, on a bilateral level, we have very strong relationships. But nonetheless, despite this very strong relationship, we have, of course, very different threat perceptions that we have in the United States and in Europe. Obviously, terrorism wasn't initially perceived in the same way. Transatlantic allies shared certain common threat perception, but also common opposition to terrorism in a certain way. Of course, countries such as Belgium and the Netherlands had very different experiences before 9/11. Spain, UK, very different compared to that. Again, Germany, Italy with experience. So after 9/11, there was a fear in Europe that, of course, America could get detached from it, something that didn't happen because we actually have very strong counterterrorism relationship. partially through the EU and of course partially also through NATO. NATO that doesn't see itself as a police force, and that of course also makes sometimes that cooperation and counterterrorism a little bit difficult, because NATO by its very nature is of course a military alliance. It isn't a police force, and of course the European Union as such puts a much stronger emphasis on criminal justice and policing when it comes to counterterrorism. So there's not a total overlap and full agreement in terms of how to fight terrorism, but of course the pressure that ensued after 9/11 really pushed relations into a much more stronger relationship, and of course NATO itself tried and I think significantly did provide a lot of value to the United States after the attacks on 9/11. In terms of counterterrorism, what NATO does, obviously at the time it invoked for the first time its collective defense clause. It developed counterterrorism policy guidelines, and it developed a terrorism intelligence cell at the NATO headquarters, coordinating NATO's efforts in the fight against terrorism. It developed also a regional hub for the South based on NATO's Joint Force Command in Naples. And of course, NATO is also a member of the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS, developed new capabilities and technologies, and also cooperates very strongly with partners and international organizations. In its counterterrorism concept, initially derived from the 2002 Prague summit, it saw its fight against terrorism in particular in 4 particular pillars: anti-terrorism, consequence management, counterterrorism, and military cooperation with civil authorities. Here, the way it's defined is anti-terrorism, a concept that defines anti-terrorism as a defensive measure that increases vulnerability, then consequence management, and of course counterterrorism, a concept that envisages 2 types of offensive alliance action to decrease vulnerability to terrorism, one where NATO is in the lead and one where NATO supports national authorities. And finally, of course, also military cooperation. Now, when former President Trump came to power, he very strongly criticized NATO at the time, and as a result of that, we saw a number of different new measures that were developed in the fight against terrorism. EU and NATO representatives would explore ways to share information about terrorist threats. Here, states, obviously always reluctant to share intelligence within NATO or within the EU, or certainly between NATO and the EU, exchange of sensitive information, politically highly controversial, with of course significant differences in opinion in terms of how to fight Islamist jihadi terrorism. Differences also in terms of whether to use a criminal justice model or whether to use a more military model in terms of fighting terrorism. And of course, the development in the European Union military structure of PESCO, the permanent structured cooperation in the EU. Now, in terms of EU-NATO cooperation specifically, we can really see that since that joint declaration of 2016 in Warsaw, we had cooperation significantly developing in 4 areas in particular. The first area where we see a lot of progress is defense and security capacity building. There, I will tell you a little bit more about all the things that have been done in that area. Then the second area is really in the area of has been at the heart of both operations, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that as well. Then maritime security, and here we've seen a lot of cooperation also after the migration crisis of 2015-2016. And of course, finally, cybersecurity. Cybersecurity, that is also a very, very important area where the 2 organizations have really cooperated very strongly. Now, if we take that first set of measures here in terms of the defense and security capacity building, we see that both the EU and NATO have developed quite a large number of really capacity building programs and partnership initiatives that really focus on counterterrorism, especially here in relation to the Middle East and MENA region, where they've developed quite a number of partnerships and initiatives. Second point where they've developed capacity is in relation to Afghanistan. Just to give you an example, there's been much closer Europol and NATO cooperation that contributed also to the improvement of sharing information, human network analysis. So that was second area. Now, of course, that is something that after the takeover of the Taliban is no longer that relevant, but it was nonetheless something that was developed. Then thirdly, there was also increasing cooperation on counterterrorism in relation to Kosovo, radicalization there, and what to do about foreign fighters. There's also increasingly a dialogue on counterterrorism in relation to EU and NATO staff that established a dialogue on counterterrorism-related issues in May of 2018. I mentioned already, but I think it's also, again, relevant to mention this particular regard the NATO Strategic Direction South Hub in Naples that was also developed in September 2017. And finally, on this first point, there's also increasing cooperation with, of course, existing EU mechanisms. Some mechanisms that I can mention, the shared awareness and deconfliction in the Mediterranean, SHADE MED is the mechanism that is called that. And of course, in relation to Frontex, the Frontex European Patrols Network, where there's also increasing cooperation with NATO. As you know, NATO has also been involved in maritime security and operated with Frontex on that point. And I will tell you a little bit more about that in a minute as well. Now, in relation to CBRN weapons proliferation, there's been the development of the NATO Joint CBRN Defense Center of Excellence. And of course, in the EU, we have the EU CBRN Center of Excellence. So this is a classic example where there's really synergy possible between those two centers of excellence. On Afghanistan, as I mentioned, of course, also there was much closer Europol and NATO cooperation in relation to CBRN weapons that contributed to the improvement of sharing information and human network analysis also here. The staff interaction, there's been a lot more on that point here in terms of NATO staff visiting Europol headquarters, and we had a number of different aspects here also in terms of CBRN. Now, finally, in relation to maritime security, there's also an increasing building of partnership on the tactical and operational levels in the Mediterranean and Aegean Sea, where increasingly NATO and the European Union have worked together also in relation to the migration issue. One of the examples here is NATO's Sea Guardian operation that was mandated to support the EU's Operation Sophia, so something that was also linked, of course, to the migration crisis, and also that the fact that NATO allies agreed to support the EU NAVFOR Operation Sophia in the implementation of UN Security Council resolutions 2236 and 2357 in relation to the arms embargo on Libya. Now, let's look finally at the area of cybersecurity. Of course, as we all know, terrorist groups continue to use the internet, and of course, they continue to use social media quite extensively. EU cyber defense staff in this regard was welcomed as participants in NATO's cyber coalition exercise, so they're really close cooperation in terms of cybersecurity. There's also information exchange between NATO and the EU on cyber that during the CMX-17 and the so-called widespread exercises. So exercises where both organizations really work closely together. And finally, there's also the fact that NATO hosted an annual high-level consultation between the EU and NATO staffs in December of 2017. So we see there's been quite a bit of movement in terms of cooperating, but you may say, well, okay, these are nice things that you can write in reports, but really have they contributed to very, very much in terms of strengthening counterterrorism cooperation? Clearly, there were a number of obstacles, and I think the obstacles, we need to acknowledge them, and those obstacles continue to be there, and they're continuing to, in a sense, create problems in terms of cooperation. Firstly, EU member states themselves don't have a fully shared understanding and perception for their role in terms of European defense. So they don't know exactly what European defense is for, what the threats are, how they're going to use them. They have different moves in that direction. Of course, there's also PESCO, structured cooperation, and of course the recent war that Russia has waged in Ukraine has also contributed to a certain, let's say, sharpening of minds in terms of European defense. But it's a totally shared perception. Secondly, something similar applies to terrorism. Of course, before 9/11, only 5 out of the 28 member states of the EU even defined terrorism as a criminal offense. And of course, that has changed after 9/11. Now all EU member states define terrorism as a crime and as a serious security threat. But the precise elements of that threat perhaps are not totally shared. We have a lot of agreement when it comes to Islamist jihadi terrorism, but when it comes to some of the other terrorist groups, there's not always agreement between member states. So that is a second obstacle to EU-NATO cooperation. Of course, it's the different relationships in terms of different EU member states being member of NATO, then others are not members of NATO, and then of course members of NATO that are not members of the EU. I particularly refer obviously also to Turkey, who is a member of NATO but isn't a member of the EU, and a couple of EU countries that are members of NATO and don't want to be, also neutral countries in the EU. But of course it's become less and less of a problem now to an extent with Sweden and Finland also joining NATO. So there's increasingly more and more overlap, but it's not a complete overlap yet. Thirdly, NATO and the EU so far have not created new formal cooperation structures. So there's informal cooperation structures that exist, and those structures are being used, but we could criticize that perhaps more formal structures would be necessary to really bring those two organizations together in terms of fighting terrorism. Also, and relatedly, in a sense, NATO and EU's capacity building endeavors, they lack certain sufficient coordination mechanisms also. There isn't sufficient coordination between the two organizations. They're kind of living side by side. In fact, if you're going to Belgium, they're not so far from one another that you couldn't coordinate, but the coordination mechanisms, they're not very, very strongly there, shall we say. Also, European members of the EU appear to be diverging in certain aspects into different clusters themselves. They don't fully agree, and there are different clusters of states that have potentially quite profound differences in terms of the threat perception of terrorism, what terrorist groups constitute a threat, and so on. And that makes cooperation, of course, also more complicated. Now, having discussed, of course, the obstacles, I want to discuss a potential way forward. How do we get to much more close relationships? How do we get to, in a sense, much closer EU-NATO counterterrorism cooperation? Well, firstly, of course, as I started saying at the beginning, and I think I'll end that presentation on that note also, is that the transatlantic relationship is essential for NATO-EU relations on counterterrorism. It starts with how well the United States gets on with a different number of EU member states, with EU as an institution and so on. And certainly with the advent, with the new Biden presidency, we've seen an increasingly warmer relationship. So we can say this is something to capitalize on. Of course, if we go back a number of years, for instance, the Snowden revelations at the time, they didn't help NATO-EU relations because of how things were perceived. So they kind of damaged, to an extent, transatlantic relations. So in that sense, it also didn't help NATO-EU relations. So in terms of bringing a way forward, we need to increase cooperation at least on 3 levels. Firstly, the first level here is the convergence of the terrorist threat perception between the two institutions. We need to ensure that ultimately both institutions agree on what the terrorist threat is, how they perceive it, and what to do with it. And secondly, we need to increasingly formalize the institutional links between the EU and NATO. Once we provide more formalization, we will also get into a habit of having more of overlaps in terms of the threat perception. And then finally, and that is very important for defense and counterterrorism in general, but is also particularly important here with EU-NATO cooperation, we need a more convergence of terrorist threat perceptions between the two institutions. And then there was just two smaller points. We need increasing formalization of the institutional links between the EU and NATO, something that is very important, and of course, increasing capabilities. So those were the 3 points: convergence of terrorist threat perception, increasing formalization, and increasing capabilities that I suggested in terms of the way forward. So I'm glad that you heard most of what I said. So now I'm ready for questions and answers.
Oh, one moment. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Kaunet, for your analysis about the European Union at NATO. And regardless of some minor technical problem, I think, you know, we covered many issues from Dr. Schittler and yourself too. But now I think, Dr. Schittler, you could reply to the question, you know, by Mr. Yash Pud, as I noticed before.
Yes, thank you so much. This is, of course, the million-dollar question, whether the Taliban are able to maintain a stable regime within Afghanistan. I mean, there are a couple of fault lines. There was quite serious disagreement at the very beginning of their rule. After August 2021, for example, they went through 5 different governors of Herat. And the internal fault lines that are existing between the more Hanafi-oriented but hardline Kandaharis, the more, it's really hard to say moderate for any part of the Taliban, but the less strict northern Taliban or western Taliban, and look towards more Iran or Central Asia, and the Haqqani network, which really is a power within the regime itself. And how these parts of the system can sustainably play together is at the moment anyone's guess, because what really is the problem here is money. For the last 20 years, the Taliban had the luck that their main resources that they had to spend was simply for the provision of arms and ammunition and paying their fighters. They really, even in the areas where they sustainably had control in the country, did not a lot of civil governance. So yes, of course, they immediately took over the courts and provided some kind of harsh but effective or at least fast justice in these areas. But when it came down to building a road, renovating a hospital, even providing school books, the Taliban were relying on the international community on aid money to do that for them, even in rural areas that were under their control, which meant there was always a disconnect between the military control of the government of Kabul and the areas in which the international community and the government of Kabul actually did spend money in the country. There was always more civil governance than military control in Afghanistan. Now, the Taliban are responsible to run the entire country, which means electricity bills to be paid, as you have seen a couple of weeks ago, for Uzbekistan, for Tajikistan, relationships with Iran, the organization of the customs organization so that goods can flow in and out of the country, which remains a big problem for the Taliban, meaning they're earning at the moment less than they need in order to create control, which also is the reason why they're pumping at the moment extraordinary amount compared to the amount of fighters they are facing into taking control of the Panjshir area, where we have the last remnants of the National Resistance Front, i.e., the son of Ahmad Shah Massoud is trying to organize some kind of internal resistance against the Taliban in order to prevent a launching pad for potential resupplies from abroad, because they do understand that their security structure is pretty much on very precarious footing in the medium to long run. What really is becoming then a question in a year or two, because the Taliban were able to amass quite a lot of reserves in the last 20 years, never spending more than they took in primarily, and I remain adamant about this, their involvement in the illicit drug trade, which does continue despite the ban in April, as it did in the late 1990s and early 2000s when they tried to ban drugs last time around. I made a presentation, I think, a couple of months ago here in this forum about their involvement and how even before the Taliban were formed, the seed money for the movement was given by three drug trafficking cartels of the Nurzai tribe for the movement. So they've been involved from the beginning in the illicit drug trade. They have developed a side business on methamphetamine because the country has the unique ability to solve one of the biggest problems of methamphetamine production, in inverted commas problems, worldwide. That is the obtaining ephedrine. This is one of the substances that you absolutely need in order to make amphetamine, and it is a highly controlled substance around the globe. If you've heard, cough syrups being misused, headache pills being misused. In Afghanistan, you have a natural source, the ephedra bush or Oman bush, that grows up over 2,500 meters high in Afghanistan quite extensively. If you dry, mill, and filter that bush, then you have nearly pure ephedrine that you can use for the methamphetamine business. This makes the Taliban several $billion, which is not enough to sustainably run the country. So then there will be a point where large-scale, very rich drug networks in Helmand, run by the Taliban, will ask a particular question. We have Gul Haq Isaaqzai as the finance ministry. That is all the Helmandi Taliban have in the Taliban regime as of now. They have a governor in Nangarhar. They had Pir Shah, a police chief in Nangarhar, and were therefore able to eradicate drugs in Nangarhar and push their internal Taliban drug competition out of the business to a certain extent in Nangarhar, but that is it. While they're supplying, by and large, the largest share of income to the Taliban movement via illicit drugs. Once those reserves are taken out, and once the demands on the Helmand Taliban drug networks grows in the amount, on the share of their drug income that they will have to spend for the sustaining of the movement, then the real fissures are going to start, which in about a year or two is going to be the situation. And then the question will be, is this leading to a breakdown of Taliban governance in the country, or can there be some arrangement be found? Will there be some changes in the power structure in Kabul and in Kandahar to accommodate this growing financial function that the Helmandi drug networks are playing, or not? The jury's still out on this at the moment. They don't have that yet as a issue that they have to contend with immediately, but this will come down the line. The other question, of course, is what to do about Sharia law in the country. Now, there are ostensibly part of the Taliban who do understand that if they would be able to provide a secondary education for women and girls in the country, that this would go a long way to accommodate some of the key demands of the international community. However, as experienced a couple of months ago in March, when the supreme leader brings together the leading religious scholars within the Taliban movement, the Rahbari Shura, the Shura that advises the supreme leader of the Taliban, Haibatullah, then the chips fall on the other side, which means no secondary education for girls and women in Afghanistan as of now. And whatever else is putting out by the Ministry of Education in Kabul, it's not a security issue. It's not an issue of textbooks. It's also not an issue of appropriate clothing, which I thought was the most ludicrous discussion in a country that invented the burqa, that there were not enough religiously appropriate attire for women to go around for them to get secondary education, while they are, by the way, allowed to go to university in some parts of Afghanistan. That means you do have a discussion on how much, or if at all, and at the moment the decision is not at all, the Taliban should accommodate some of the concerns of the international community, which will effectively prevent them from having a representation at the UN, and therefore, once you got the UN representation, you have representation also in the other international fora. That issue is still out, compounded by the fact that Zawahiri died a couple of days ago in Kabul, not some cave inside Afghanistan, but in Kabul, in Shirpur neighborhood, which was the neighborhood where most of the senior officials of the Afghan government lived since the mid-2000s, which is run by a company that is owned by the Afghan government, now taken over by the Taliban, but still maintaining the same manager that President Ghani put in place, i.e. it is government housing, and that particular building belonged to the Interior Ministry and was under control of Sirajuddin Haqqani, the acting Interior Minister of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which clearly showed that this was not someone sneaking into Kabul or the Taliban not being aware. They, especially the Haqqani network, were sheltering them, which is again an obstacle in the face of some kind of recognition. But you see this front slowly eroding, at least until the Zawahiri issue. You had the reopening of the Indian embassy in Afghanistan. You had Germany, at least in the European Union, thinking about doing the same. You have now the takeover of the embassies by the Taliban abroad in 7 countries: China, Pakistan, Russia, UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, which is a slippery slope towards international recognition, because there is a point where you have to ask yourself, what does international recognition actually mean? Usually, in the traditional sense, it means you exchange ambassadors. Now, if you already have an ambassador abroad, all it takes is the upgrading of the embassy to ambassadorial level in Kabul, and then you have, by all intents and purposes, a recognized Taliban regime, operationally, if not even legally. So we are a little bit at the crossroads here, and I think the Zawahiri issue was a very welcome, from my perspective, reminder of the massive risks, not only as far as illicit drugs out of Afghanistan is concerned, which supply all of Europe, all of Russia, most of Africa, and all of Asia, with heroin and methamphetamine. The Taliban produce more drugs than in these 2 categories than all of the drug networks on the globe in any other region combined. 80% of the heroin market, a growing share of the methamphetamine market, and of course the remaining terrorist problems, as well as terrorist financing problems. The UN is flying in around $36 million in hard cash every month into Kabul right now, slowly transforming the Afghan economy away from the Afghan as the currency on which the economy operates into US dollar-based economy. Flying hard cash in is just about the most risky thing that you can do, because the risk of diversion of hard cash towards terrorism, towards criminality, is higher than in any other form. But at the moment, that's the way that the UN operates. Our argument at the Counter-Extremism Project, and slowly but surely we're not alone with this, is that we had relieved most of the sanctions pressure from the Taliban in December last year, with the US publishing General License 14 to 20, with the EU on the back of UN Security Council Resolution 2615, which basically suspended most of the 1988 sanctions if you are a humanitarian actor or involved in the provision of basic human needs, a completely undefined term. And we need to reevaluate whether this opening of floodgates was in this kind of extent necessary, or whether we need at least better control mechanisms for the finances on the ground, because there's the first couple of media reports, and I'm sure there will be more in the future, that aid gets diverted away from its intended purposes by the Taliban towards other purposes, including personal enrichment, and that is an effect that is only going to grow. So, in a nutshell, we are looking towards stormy times in Afghanistan on just about every single front.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schindler, for the thorough, well-structured response to the gentleman. And we have another question from Mr. Deshmucha, if I pronounce right, I guess, with an increasing collaboration between different groups, how control of terrorism can be made more effective? Christian, would you like to? No, he's gone again. He left. So, Mr. Yasia.
So I think he'll rejoin. So probably if we can wait for another 1 minute or so.
He's back. He's back. Christian, can you hear me?
Hello. Yes, I can hear you fine.
Yes. Can you just respond to the control of terrorism? If the control of terrorism can be made more effective from different groups, I guess from Europe, whatever.
Sorry, could you repeat the question again? I could only hear the second half.
They said with increasing collaboration between different groups, how control of terrorism can be made more effective?
Yes, I think one of the things obviously is very clear in terms of once the terrorists are cooperating much more, once it's becoming a transnational multi-group kind of movement, you need to do the same side on the area of counterterrorism. You need to have EU member states and NATO and all of those countries working much more closely together and to cooperate so that they can fight them much more effectively. I think it's very clear, as much as the terrorists are cooperating closely, also member states need to cooperate much more closely.
Okay. All right. So we don't have another question, just a response. Thanks to Dr. Schindler for summarize the entire scenario with a few minutes. Now, if you allow me, I can shortly summarize, what the two distinguished scholars spoke. Dr. Schindler talked geographically about, the ISIS, especially ISIS in the West and Al-Qaeda. Of course, he talked about the domestic threat we face in Europe, and then exploring, how ISIS and Al-Qaeda, are quite active, in the Gulf State, of course, in Afghanistan. We could see, the affiliate of the Al-Qaeda groups in Africa, in many areas, in Somalia and so on. And even though, the West has succeeded, to assassinate some of the major leaders of Al-Qaeda, we come to the point that this, baseless group is having always, the way to recome to a new form, like in Greece, Dr. Schiller, we call them Hydra, the Hydra Syndrome. Sometimes you cut the neck, but there is another neck coming out. So this is a kind of the Hydra Syndrome that Al-Qaeda and ISIS is coming out. So, and this takes place all the way from Southeast Asia to Caucasus to Caspian, in Africa, of course, quite active in Africa. In Europe, we always have to take care and worry about that. In Latin America, all right, never underestimate Latin America, and of course, North America, like Canada and the United States. So Dr. Schindler gave really a very strong picture of how, these terrorist groups are spread out all over the region, and how powerful they are by, just come, and make alliances with local groups all over the world, and try, to create as many destabilization process in the countries and the government. Comparison now with the Dr. Christian, who was focused more or less on the European Union and NATO. Of course, NATO is a military alliances. It's not a police state, all right? It's not a police alliances. Of course, the European Union right now lacks of having a European army. Of course, they have the Europol, some law enforcement, like, institution in Frontex, which is the EU border institution. But besides the economic power they have to support all this new initiative, there is no such an efficient operational capacity. All right. I mean, they collect information, they fund it, all this initiative, but again, they have to depend on the EU member state and provide the recommendation and solutions to the problems. As you realize, the intelligence sharing among the EU sometimes is effective, sometimes is not effective, because intelligence information is very sensitive. And even though we have it, Christian knows quite well, we have made, different groups how to promote intelligence, like the France did, the EU Intelligence School, and I'm running the the EU Intelligence Academy, and Belgium, they have the Military Defense School. Unfortunately, we don't have come to a very productive intelligence sharing, how to combat all the problems that we are facing. But let's keep, let's be optimistic that sooner or later we have to move on this direction. And on the other side, like Professor Christian said, Christian Kaunet said that most of the EU member states are NATO states too. All right, and the country that we have to really collaborate, except the United States, which is a priority country to collaborate. I would probably say right now, and publicly, that India in the Southeast Asia, which is the largest democratic state, should have to play a critical role geographically in Southeast Asia, like the United States, in North America and Latin America. Because we, the Europeans, expect the West, included USA, Canada, and the rest of the Western countries, to collaborate on security issues. But now, it's about time to have India as the largest democratic countries in the region, and next year, the largest countries in population overpassing China from the South and Asia, to collaborate critically on sharing intelligence, all right, and economic security, of course, with EU, with European Union. And allow me to say that India should collaborate with NATO too, even though, geographically it's not close, but we cannot depend only, on the Western alliances. India is about time to be more politely aggressive and sharing, information with the West. All right, we have to say that, and it's about time to realize that China is a communist state. Russia right now is very busy, on energy security and Ukraine. We never know how Ukraine is going to out. So who is going really to fulfill and cover the vacuum and dealing with these international security issues? So I think we should, Dr. Schigler and Professor Kaunet, realize that India is not just geographically located in Southeast Asia, but it's about time to become really a regional superpower in the region and help the West to combat all the international terrorist groups, like Dr. Steele said, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and like Professor Kauner said, are related to the problem that we face in Europe. We need India, as well the United States and the rest of the Western countries that can help us. That's I have to say, and I want to thank all of you for the great discussions, and I'm very happy, to coordinate such a wonderful and very productive and effective panel. And thank you, the Indic Research Forum, especially my good friend, Mr. Yashia, for inviting me to be with you. It was really a pleasure for me. Thank you, sir.